March 15th, 44 BC. The floor of the Senate House is cold beneath your feet, but not as cold as the deathly silence that has just fallen. At the feet of his greatest rival, Pompey the Great, the most powerful man the world has ever known lies, his life staining the white marble. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, crosser of the Rubicon, self-made god, now a body pierced by 23 daggers. A quiet horror hangs in the air, but it does not come from violence. It comes from a more terrifying truth. The murderers believed themselves heroes. 60 senators, 60 men considered the cream of Rome, had joined forces to commit an act of liberation. They called themselves liberators, and in that moment, as Caesar's blood began to curdle, they were convinced they had just saved the Roman Republic from tyranny. They were tragically wrong. They had not saved the Republic. They had signed its death warrant and their own. They had opened the gates of hell, handing the world over to a power far more brutal than Caesar. The liberators, led by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, had expected something very different. They had envisioned Romans pouring into the streets, throwing flowers and cheering. They had prepared speeches about the virtues of the Republic, about liberty, about overthrowing a tyrant. Instead, what greeted them was silence. A heavy, terrifying silence, more so than a shout. That silence was history's first rejection of their actions. For ordinary Romans, the plebeians, did not live in marble villas. Their lives were cramped, rickety lodgings called insulae, buildings that could collapse or burn at any moment. They toiled in scorching bakeries, on dangerous construction sites, and as heavy porters. To them, the abstract philosophical concepts of the Republic that the aristocratic senators preached meant nothing. Caesar, whom the senators called a tyrant, was their benefactor. He gave them bread through grain distribution programs, gave them jobs through large-scale public works projects, and most importantly, he brought stability after decades of bloody civil war. Caesar had ended the chaos. These senators, with their bloody knives, brought only chaos and empty promises. The mastermind behind it all was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man of undeniable military talent, but also harboring a deep personal hatred for Caesar. This hatred was more than mere dissent. It had festered into a poison that was eating away at his soul. Cassius had served under Caesar, had witnessed his meteoric rise from brilliant general to all-powerful dictator, and he believed that only death could stop the man. But Cassius was smart enough to know that a mere assassination would be considered a cowardly murder. He needed a symbol, a name that could legitimize their actions, turn murder into an act of divine justice. And he found that symbol in Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was a complex figure, a living tragedy. He was the son of Caesar's longtime lover, Servilia, and Caesar had loved and protected him as his own son, even more so than his later adopted son, Octavian. Brutus was a Stoic, a man of philosophy and principle. But more importantly, he was the bloodline of Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary hero who had expelled the last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus, and founded the Republic 500 years earlier. For Cassius, wooing Brutus was a stroke of genius. If the descendant of the founder of the Republic were to kill a would-be king, it would not be regicide, but liberation a second time. It would be history repeating itself, a supremely symbolic act. Cassius planted the seeds of doubt in Brutus's mind, that his personal love for Caesar could not outweigh his love and duty to the Republic. He exploited Brutus' internal conflict between personal loyalty and political ideals until Brutus was convinced that this terrible act was a necessary sacrifice. The recruitment of the remaining conspirators was done carefully and meticulously. Cassius and Brutus approached senators who felt their careers had stalled under Caesar's regime, military commanders tarnished by his glory, idealistic young men who truly believed in the values of the Republic, and old aristocratic families who felt their influence waning. Each conspirator had his own reasons for wanting Caesar dead: political ambitions, wounded pride, philosophical convictions, or personal grudges that had simmered for years. They chose the perfect theatrical moment, the Ides of March, March 15th, when Caesar was scheduled to make a major speech before the Senate at the theatre of Pompey. The irony was cruel. Caesar would die at the feet of a statue of Pompey, the greatest enemy he had defeated in the Civil War. The building built to honor the man he destroyed will become his own tomb. But fate almost took a different turn. The night before the Ides of March, Caesar's wife Calpurnia was tormented by terrible nightmares. She dreamed that their roof had collapsed, that Caesar lay bleeding in her arms, and that she wept over his body. The next morning, she begged Caesar to stay home, to postpone the Senate meeting, to listen to the soothsayers who warned him to beware the Ides of March. Even Caesar, accustomed to disregarding omens, was shaken. The great general who had unhesitatingly crossed the Rubicon, who had conquered vast territories, was now swayed by a woman's dream. But then another conspirator, Decimus Brutus, not Marcus Brutus, arrived at Caesar's home. With clever words and subtle taunts, Decimus struck at Caesar's most vulnerable point: pride. Would the great Caesar disappoint the Senate because of a woman's dream? What would people say if he stayed home because his wife had a nightmare? Caesar could not bear to be seen as weak or superstitious. Despite all his premonitions and warnings, he decided to go to the Senate. As Caesar entered the theatre, a Greek teacher named Artemidorus, who had discovered the plot, tried to save him. He pressed a scroll into Caesar's hand detailing the conspirators and their plans. "Read it at once," he urged. "It concerns you personally." But Caesar, surrounded by senators competing for his attention, handed the scroll to an aide without reading it. The scroll that might have saved his life lay forgotten. The conspirators surrounded Caesar under the pretext of presenting a petition. Tullius Cimber stepped forward, grabbed Caesar's cloak and pulled it from his shoulders. The signal. Caesar shouted, "Why, this is violence!" Immediately the first blade flashed. Publius Casca was the first to strike, his blade grazing Caesar's neck, a shallow wound where his hand trembled with tension. Caesar, with a warrior's reflex, turned and grabbed Casca's wrist. "Casca, you bastard, what are you doing?" he roared. Then more blades appeared. 10, 20, 60, a forest of steel converging on a single man. Most of the wounds were not fatal. The senators, many of whom had never before held a weapon in battle, stabbed wildly and frantically, some even stabbing each other in the chaos. Caesar fought like a cornered lion. He had no weapons, but he fought back with his bare hands, with his shouts, with his authority. For a moment, it seemed as if the most powerful man in the world could fight off 60 assassins alone. But then he saw a face in the crowd of assassins that changed everything. Marcus Junius Brutus, his favorite son, stepped forward, dagger in hand. Historians record that, in that moment, all Caesar's resistance melted away. Some say he uttered the famous words, "Et tu, Brute," and "You too, Brutus." Others record something even more heartbreaking, a wordless, choked cry of recognition and betrayal, a wound deeper than any blade. Caesar looked Brutus in the eyes one last time, then pulled his cloak over his head. He did not want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him die. He did not want Brutus to see the pain in his eyes. He fell at the foot of Pompey's statue, 23 wounds. Physicians later determined that only one, through the heart, was fatal. The conspirators stood over Caesar's body, their daggers dripping with blood, their cloaks stained. They raised their weapons to the sky and proclaimed, "Liberty is restored." Brutus tried to address the horrified senators and onlookers, explaining that they had killed a tyrant, not a man. But they were met with only eerie silence. They marched to the Capitoline Hill, brandishing their bloody knives. But instead of being welcomed, they found people fleeing, closing shops, barring doors. This was not liberation. This was chaos. They had isolated themselves on a hill, surrounded by a city that looked at them with fear and suspicion. Meanwhile, Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, the second most powerful man after Caesar, was absent from the Senate. One of the conspirators had cleverly kept him out. When he heard the news, Antony's first reaction was to flee, knowing he could be next. But Antony was no coward. He was a shrewd politician and a seasoned general. Instead of fleeing, he played the most dangerous political game of his life. He pretended to negotiate with the assassins, publicly shaking their hands, even inviting them to dinner. The conspirators, desperate for legitimacy, seized the opportunity. The Senate, fearing a new civil war, hastily passed an amnesty for all the conspirators. For a brief moment, it seemed like disaster had been averted. But then, they made one final mistake. A fatal mistake. They agreed to give Caesar a state funeral. The funeral of Julius Caesar became one of the great turning points in Western history. Brutus was the first to speak. His speech was a masterpiece of Stoic philosophy, cold, rational, logical. He explained that he had not killed Caesar out of hatred, but out of a greater love for Rome. It is not that I love Caesar less, but I love Rome more." The crowd listened in confusion. Brutus's argument was sound, but it did not touch their hearts. Then came Mark Antony. Antony was no philosopher. He was a man of passion, of emotion, and one of the greatest orators Rome had ever produced. He took the podium, not to shout accusations, but to begin in a near whisper. "My friends, my Romans, my countrymen, listen to me. I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." He began by acknowledging that the evils of men often live on, while the good are buried with their bones. He called Brutus a man of honor. He called them all men of honor. But then Antony began to list Caesar's accomplishments. The conquest of Gaul that filled the Roman treasury, the victories that expanded the empire, the mercy he showed his enemies, and the wealth he brought to the city. After each achievement, Antony repeats his refrain. But Brutus said he had ambition, and Brutus was a man of honor. With each repetition, the word honor becomes bitter, sarcastic, turning into a venomous accusation. The crowd began to murmur, then stir restlessly. Antony's voice grew stronger. He spoke of Caesar's love for the Roman people, of how the dictator wept when the poor wept. Then came the final blow. Antony stepped down from the platform and approached Caesar's body. With a dramatic gesture, he tore off the blood-soaked cloak, revealing 23 horrific wounds. "Look," he said, his voice breaking. "Here is where Cassius's knife pierced. Here is the wound made by Casca's jealousy. And through here the beloved Brutus stabbed." The crowd gasped. This was no longer philosophy. This was a flesh-and-blood man who had fed them, entertained them, butchered by the very people he trusted most. But Antony wasn't done yet. He pulled out a scroll, Caesar's will. It announced that the late dictator had bequeathed his private gardens on the banks of the Tiber River to the Roman people, to be used as a permanent public park. The crowd roared. Then came the final blow. Caesar had bequeathed 75 silver denarii to every Roman citizen, a sum more than most of them earned in a year. The gates of hell had opened. Brutus's rational speech had evaporated like smoke. Pure, raw emotion exploded in the crowd. They did not know Caesar the politician. They knew Caesar the patron. Their rage and grief turned to fury. They tore down wooden benches and merchant stalls to build an instant funeral pyre right in the square. As the flames rose to the sky, the crowd was no longer mourners. They became a hunting party. They snatched torches from the pyre and hunted down the assassins. Their first victim was an innocent man, the poet Helvius Cinna, who had the misfortune to share a name with one of the conspirators. The crowd surrounded him. His pleas were in vain. They tore him limb from limb in the street. It was the first payment of a blood debt. Brutus, Cassius, and the others watched this horrific scene from their homes. Their dream of a republic had become a nightmare. They fled Rome that night, no longer senators, but hunted fugitives. But while the conspirators fled east, the real danger had just arrived in Italy. His name was Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian and eventually Augustus Caesar. He was 18 years old, sickly, unknown, and completely ignored by Roman politics. When news of his assassination reached the ears of most, it was assumed he would become little more than a footnote in history. The real bombshell was not Caesar's death, but his will. The dictator had formally adopted the unknown young man as his son and chief heir, leaving him not only his vast fortune, but also something far more priceless, the Caesar name. By the time Octavian arrived in Rome, Mark Antony had consolidated power. Antony considered the teenager a nuisance and refused to hand over his inheritance, using the money to buy his own loyalty. This was a fatal mistake. Octavian did something unprecedented. He sold all his family's possessions, everything he owned, to pay the Roman people the 75 denarii Caesar had promised. The effect was immediate. Overnight, the despised teenager became a hero to the Roman people and, more importantly, to Caesar's veterans. These soldiers loved Caesar as a father, and they saw in his adopted son the image of their fallen commander. Within months, the unknown 18-year-old had assembled a private army of scrupulously loyal men. The rivalry between Antony and Octavian quickly erupted into war. But while they fought, disturbing news arrived from the east. Brutus and Cassius had not been idle. They had invaded Rome's richest eastern provinces, plundering the treasury, extorting money from the populace, and raising huge armies. They had amassed 19 legions, a force capable of challenging Rome itself. The news forced Antony and Octavian to set aside their feud. They met on a small island, along with Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's generals. There, the the three men formed a second triumvirate, a predatory alliance. They would divide the Roman world like butchers dividing an animal. But before they could face the assassins, they had to clean up the mess. They circulated prescriptions, public death lists. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy Romans were declared enemies of the state. Anyone could kill them for a reward. Rome descended into a brutal bloodbath. Slaves killed masters. Sons betrayed fathers. The city became a hunting ground. Antony singled out one name on the list: Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero was no assassin, but his crime was worse. He had used his eloquence to expose Antony in a series of fiery speeches called the Philippics. Antony never forgave him. Octavian, Cicero's mentor, coolly agreed to his teacher's death sentence. It was his first major betrayal. The assassins found Cicero at his villa. The 63-year-old orator calmly walked out to meet them. They beheaded him, and on Antony's orders, the hands that had written those speeches. Cicero's head and hands were nailed to the platform in the Roman Forum where he had spoken in defense of the Republic. Antony's wife, Fulvia, is said to have stabbed Cicero's tongue multiple times with a hairpin. The voice of the Republic had been brutally silenced. With Rome purged and its treasury overflowing with blood money, the triumvirate turned east. The final showdown was imminent. At Philippi, in eastern Macedonia, in 42 BC, the largest Roman army in history had assembled. More than 200,000 men were prepared to slaughter each other. On one side stood the forces of the triumvirate, Antony and Octavian, with 28 battle-hardened legions. They fought in Caesar's name. On the other, Brutus and Cassius commanded 19 legions, fighting for a dying cause, the restoration of the Republic. Cassius's strategy was prudent. His forces were better equipped, controlled the sea lanes, and held the high ground. He knew that time was on their side. But Brutus, the idealistic philosopher, was crumbling under the pressure. The omens in his camp were dire. More worrying were Brutus's personal torments. Many sources claim that the ghost of Julius Caesar appeared in his tent the night before battle. "Who are you?" Brutus asked. "I am your evil spirit, Brutus," the ghost replied. "We shall meet again at Philippi." Whether it was true or just the figment of a guilty conscience, it deeply affected Brutus. Under pressure from his officers, and against Cassius's advice, Brutus ordered the attack. The first battle of Philippi, on October 3rd, was a chaos. It was actually two battles fought simultaneously. On the right wing, Brutus's army crushed Octavian's force. Octavian's camp was captured, and he himself nearly lost his life. From Brutus's perspective, it was a resounding victory. But on the left wing, it was a completely different story. Antony's veteran legions crushed Cassius's force. They were professional war machines, and they mowed down Cassius's army ruthlessly. Cassius retreated to a hill to observe. In the distance, he saw smoke rising from what he thought was Brutus's camp, but it was actually Octavian's camp being sacked by Brutus's troops. When he saw a cavalry charge toward him, Cassius assumed the worst. In fact, it was Brutus's men coming to deliver the news of victory. But in the dust and panic, Cassius saw only the enemy. In that tragic moment of misunderstanding, the man who had started the plot against Caesar made his final decision. He ordered his freedman, Pindarus, to kill him with the same dagger he had used to stab Caesar. When Brutus's messengers arrived, they found only a corpse. When Brutus arrived and saw Cassius's body, his spirit was completely broken. He called his friend the last of the Romans. The mastermind of the conspiracy was dead. Its spirit, Brutus, was still alive, but he was not a general. For the next 3 weeks, the two sides faced each other. Morale in the Republican camp collapsed. Soldiers began deserting. Brutus, racked by guilt and haunted by Caesar's ghost, was no longer himself. On October 23rd, he ordered the final assault. The Second Battle of Philippi was nothing like the chaos of the first. It was a systematic slaughter. Brutus's demoralized army was easily defeated by the veterans of Antony and Octavian. The dream of the Roman Republic died amid the screams of thousands fleeing for their lives. Brutus escaped with a small band of loyal officers. In the darkness of a Greek forest, he finally understood the whole truth. He looked at his remaining friends and said in despair, "Oh, virtue, I pursued you as truth, but you turned out to be nothing but empty words." The idealist had collapsed before reality. He had killed his mentor for an abstract principle, and that principle died before his eyes. Refusing to endure the humiliation of being captured alive, Brutus asked a friend to hold his sword while he plunged. The spirit of the conspiracy was dead. When Antony found the body, he covered it with his purple cloak. calling Brutus the noblest Roman of all, but Octavian ordered Brutus's head cut off and sent back to Rome to be thrown at the feet of Caesar's statue. The hunt for the remaining 58 conspirators lasted more than a decade. None of Caesar's assassins died of old age. All died violent deaths. Blood debts were paid in full. But while Octavian hunted Caesar's killers, something else happened. With each Republican senator who died, his power grew more absolute. The conspirators stabbed Caesar to prevent a monarchy. In the power vacuum they created something far worse: an emperor. With the last of his assassins dead, Octavian stood alone at the top of the Roman world. In 27 BC, he pulled off a masterful political move. He restored the Republic in form, while retaining all real power in his own hands. The grateful Senate named him Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. He ruled for 44 years and died peacefully in his bed, worshipped as a god. The liberators killed Caesar to prevent a king. Instead, they created an emperor and destroyed the Republic forever. Their 23 stabs did not stop tyranny. They simply selected another tyrant. The blood that pooled on the floor of the Senate house that day sealed the fate of Rome. The conspirators thought they were heroes, saving liberty. But in reality, they were only gravediggers, burying the last remnants of the Republic under marble slabs carved by their own violence.